Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Sabletti. We're on chapter 11, which is page 117, and it starts with a quote from Henry Whistler Barbados, written in 1655. The gentry here doth live far better than ours do in England. They have most of them 100 or two or three of the slaves apiece, who they command as they please. Here they may say what they have is their own, and they have that liberty of conscience which we so long in England have fought for, but they do abuse it. Again, that was a quote from Henry Whistler Barbados, written in 1655. We're going to get into their discussion about Barbados momentarily, right after the introduction.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Atlantic sugar plantation system took shape in the late 15th century on the previously uninhabited island that the Portuguese called Sao Tome, off the coast of Calabar in the Crook of Africa. Settled by explorer Alvarado Camina in 1493, the same year Columbus brought experimental sugar seedlings to the present day Dominican Republic, Sao Tome, built on the previous model of Mediterranean sugar plantations, but employed previously unthinkable quantities of labor to produce sugar on a new large scale. The labor was available to Sao Tome already, access to the slave markets. It was a transshipment point for slaves headed to the Americas. By the 1550s, Sao Tome had 60 sugar mills grinding, with individual plantations boasting workforces of as many as 300 slaves. The Portuguese applied the Sao Tome model to create the first great sugar industry of the Americas in northeastern Brazil, where a full scale planter's aristocracy had entrenched itself by the mid 16th century. There was a major difference, however. The labor force in Brazil was mostly made up of enslaved indigenous Brazilians who quickly proved to be unsatisfactory laborers. In a pattern later replicated throughout the hemisphere, a transition began in Brazil to African slave labor. Wanting in on the sugar action, the Dutch captured Sao Tome in 1598 to 1599. While paused from attacking the Spanish and Portuguese merchant vessels during the 12 Years' Truce, which was from 1609 to 1621, they built up their navy. They established Dutch outposts in North America beginning in 1615 with Fort Nassau on the Hudson River and including, as of 1625, Fort Amsterdam, which would be the future New York City, at the tip of Manhattan Island. With its defensive battery positioned on the present day site of Battery Park, Fort Amsterdam provided protection for the Dutch families who had been consolidated there from around the region. New Amsterdam was from the beginning dense, secular, tolerant, with Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi, and multilingual. The colony's first shipment of both slaves slaves, 11 in all, came in the colony's second year, making it the second colony after Virginia in the present day United States to import African slaves. So, as you can see, they already had their eyes right for slavery because they needed that labor to run those plantations. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Slaves in New Amsterdam were corporately owned by the Dutch West India Corporation. With time, they were manumitted and even given land of their own, though they had to give a portion of their proceeds back to the company. On July 14th, 1645, the free African Paulo de Angola was granted a parcel of land on present day Washington Square Park. Anthony Congo was granted a parcel on the east side of the Bowery from a point between present day Hudson and Stanton Streets to Riverton. On March 25th, 1647, Francisco and Simon Congo were given nearby plots. They were exposed pioneers in a bad neighborhood, forming the buffer zone between the Dutch and the lower tip of Manhattan and the Native Americans to the north who might decide to raid. So they put the Africans right in the middle as a buffer zone between the colonists, between the white people, and the Native Americans. As Dutch commercial policy became more aggressive, the Dutch fleet assaulted Portugal's markets in Asia. Then, in the 1620s, began a war for the European sugar market, which was principally supplied at that time by two Brazilian centers of Salvador da Bahia and Recliff de Pernambuco. They took Recife in 1641. They could not hold Salvador. From their vantage point in Brazil, the Dutch saw a double commercial opportunity nearby on the English controlled island of Barbados. In taking advantage of it, they created the Antillean sugar industry. Barbados was easy for 17th century navigators to miss. Located in the Atlantic, 100 or so miles to the east of the arc of the rest of the Lesser Antilles, it's a patch of land comprising some 166 square miles. Off the main sea road, it was the farthest from the major Spanish bases in the Americas and it offered a relatively easy sail to Europe. Barbados means bearded ones in Spanish, though why the island was called that is a mystery. The Spanish had claimed the unoccupied island in 1511, but it was abandoned by the time the English occupied it in 1627, just as the Dutch were making their move into Brazil. Sent by a commercial syndicate in London, the English expedition to settle Barbados paused on the way to capture a prize. In other words, to plunder another country's vessel. They stole 10 Negro slaves who were taken to Barbados along with 80 settlers that disembarked on February 17, 1627. The island had no native population, but Captain Henry Powell induced 32 agriculturally knowledgeable native people from Dutch held Guyana to come to Barbados, then enslaved them once they were there. Starvation would not be an immediate problem. The island teemed with wild hogs, the legacy of long gone Spanish presence. Colonists killed them off in 3 years flat. The Barbadian colonists tried raising tobacco at the same time it was being developed in Virginia and Maryland, but their product was of even poorer quality than the Chesapeake's, and they had problems getting labor because Barbados' checkered reputation in England made recruiting difficult. As had happened over and over in the Americas, crooks and whores were sent as the first colonists, but they were far from satisfactory as plantation workers. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The trade balance between England and its colonies was projected to be even via barter, without a need for settling accounts by transatlantic flow of silver and gold that was wanted elsewhere. Since London had made the rules and set the prices, London could tinker with the numbers as it liked. But just as the London planters were caught by surprise when Virginia became a tobacco exporter, they didn't count on the Dutch setting up English colonists in Barbados in the sugar business from a base in Brazil. What happened in the 1640s, while England was embroiled in the civil war between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, was that Barbados had both political tendencies present, but neither controlled the society definitively, and the island was practically independent even during those years, enjoying what was effectively free trade with vessels of various flags. The Dutch, not the English, made the Barbadians rich. Fueled by substantial injection of Dutch capital, something strictly forbidden by London, the Barbadians learned how to make sugar via Dutch intermediaries and also by first-hand observations from the traveling to Brazil. The Dutch had a lot to offer the Barbadians, and they could make a profit at every step of the process. They provided the Barbadians with Europe's cheapest credit to get started making a fortune in sugar and waited until the sugar was on the market to collect and refinance. They sold them the machinery and the technology. They refined the molasses into sugar in Europe and sold the sugar in the lucrative Dutch markets. The Dutch could also provide the crucial and most expensive element, the labor. As a complement to taking Brazil in 1637, they took the Portuguese slave castle of Elmina off the shore of the Gold Coast. They established posts on the slave coast of present-day Benin that were controlled from Alada or Ardra. For a time, the Dutch controlled Luanda and the Benguela in Angola as well. The strategic reason to occupy the slave ports was to support the Dutch sugar venture in Brazil, where the labor force died or escaped into the wilderness in large numbers, even as acreage under cultivation was increasing. As a consequence of their move to Africa, the Dutch had plenty of slave trading capacity with which to service the English, who were not yet engaged in the commercial African slave trade. The Dutch didn't rule the Brazilian Northeast for long. The Brazilian planters rebelled against them in 1645, but by the time they drove the Dutch out definitively in 1654, the Barbadians had copied their techniques for making sugar and they were making fortunes. The sugar revolution transformed Barbados along with the skills the Barbadians learned from the Dutch, and the Brazilians were the management of hundreds of slaves in a single plantation. When they converted Barbados to slave labor, they did it massively and quickly. Barbados then became the place where Englishmen surrounded themselves with large numbers of enslaved Africans. The Barbadian planters had been purchasing indentures of white servants, but they made an abrupt transition to purchasing the legal rights to the bodies and the future increase or children of black laborers. They imported large numbers of kidnapped Africans because, as with the later sugar regimes, their labor force was not self producing. Though we breed both Negroes, horses, and cattle, wrote Richard Ligon in Barbados, yet that increase will not supply the moderate decays which we find in all of those. So even though they were breeding people, horses, and cows, they weren't replacing themselves at a high enough rate. Along with the changeover to a slave society, came accumulation by dispossession with the mortgage as a primary tool. The Dutch were conservative about whom they extended credit to, making for a concentration of large planters. The wealthy then extended credit to the less wealthy by means of a mortgage and foreclosed when they could not pay, as land ownership consolidated. Many former indentured servants had been given small patches of ground at the end of their tenure. Now, the small farmholds of 40 different farmers became the 800-acre property of a single sugar baron, one Captain Waterman. The new Barbadian sugar planters quickly developed, in Richard S. Dunn's words, a code of conduct that would never be tolerated at home. In the islands, there were no elders. The young were in control, and many a planter made his fortune and died by the age of 30. In short, Caribbean and New England planters were polar opposites. They represented the outer limits of English social expression in the 17th century. But these two outer limits did business with each other, as Barbados was dependent on New England for much of its food. Barbados's sugar revolution was well underway in 1645 when the island's black population was 5,680 people. Guadeloupe and Martinique, belonging to the enemy commercial systems of France, quickly followed in the conversion to sugar with the help of Dutch exiles from Brazil. On the other side of the Atlantic, some of Glasgow's first factories were rum distilleries, which added value to the molasses. Glasgowian merchants were importing from the Antilles already in the 1640s. So these white people were doing business with one another the whole time, even though they wanted to present as enemies. The forecast says when they got kicked out of Spain, many went to the Netherlands, and they were the first to put us, slaves, on credit, the Dutch. As Barbados was experiencing its first rush of sugar prosperity, the execution of King Charles in 1649 sent the Cavaliers fleeing to the island. They seized control of its government following a pamphlet war and armed action. So they were passing out flyers and they also had guns, making the island into a royalist stronghold. By the following year, Barbados had declared itself for Charles II, who was in French exile. Austere, regicidal, militarized, religious extremists, the Puritan government was unpopular at home, but Barbados was in open rebellion. More consequently, Barbados's practice of free trade with the Dutch antagonized the politically powerful London merchants and shippers who were not happy about losing their captive market to foreign competition. Speaking of the Dutch, the forecast says a lot of the Dutch were actually Jews, which explains why Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews were accepted in these places. An embargo, the Act of 1650, froze all English trade with Barbados as well as with the other royalist colonies, including Virginia, and authorized the confiscation of all merchandise headed there. That became a hot issue in New England, whose trade with Barbados was its most profitable commercial activity. So it's always about the economy. Barbados issued what was essentially a Declaration of Independence on February 18, 1651, charging Parliament with placing it in a state of slavery, a word that would resound through a pro independence polemics on the North American mainland in the 18th century. Barbadian cavaliers confiscated the lands of the Barbadian Roundheads. According to an anguished letter written from Barbados, they had sequestered 52 gallant plantations, who were wherewith as all ye islands besides. Meanwhile, Barbadian royalist lands in England, Scotland, and Ireland were confiscated by Parliament. The Puritan Parliament passed a Navigation Act in 1651 that forbade trading with foreigners, requiring the use of English ships and captains for all commerce. That quickly led to war between England and the Netherlands, leaving the Barbadian planters Dutch business contracts on the wrong side of hostilities. Believing perhaps incorrectly that Cromwell was out to destroy them, the Barbadian planters openly favored their Dutch commercial partners over their English colonial masters, effectively committing treason during wartime. With instructions to seize Dutch merchantmen, Cromwell Admiral Sir George Askew blockaded the island in 1652. Then, despite having only a small force, he attacked with the support of scurvy ridden troops who had detoured from their mission of subduing Virginia. He bluffed the Barbadian royalists into surrendering and established a government loyal to the Parliament, the Puritan Parliament. But the damage was done to the British colonial system. Barbados had experienced independence and free trade. Greetings, MG2. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Askew's victory was only the beginning of Cromwell's military designs. After making peace with the Dutch in 1654, he began a project, the Western Design, it was called, to drive the Spanish out of the Americas. Unfortunately, Cromwell sent an untrained, incoherent expedition of conquest to base itself in Barbados in 1655, there to provision itself on the island dependent on importation of its food. Depleting the island's scant resources, the English fleet funded itself by laying high duties on the island's imports. That there was already a nascent slave breeding business of sorts in Barbados is suggested by the journal of a member of the Western Design Expedition, a Puritan named Henry Whistler, who noted in 1655 that children had a cash value at birth and that there was a market in them, saying, "This island is inhabited with all sorts, the English, French, Dutch, Scots, Irish, Spaniards, they being Jews, with Indians, and miserable Negroes born to perpetual slavery, they and their seeds. These Negroes now do allow as many wives as they will have. Some will have 3 or 4 according as they find their body able. Our English here do think that a Negro child, the first day it is born, is worth about £5 11 shillings. They cost them nothing to bring up. They go as always naked. Some planters will have 30 or more or less, about 4 or 5 years old. They sell them from one to another as we do sheep. The principle of partus sequitur ventrum was already in place. By 1650, certainly, and probably a good bit earlier, writes Dunn, slavery in Barbados had become more than a lifetime condition. It extended through the slaves' children to posterity. The idea that one caste of people, visibly different, could be born into bondage conflated the condition of slavery with the concept of race. Before leaving Barbados on its mission of conquest, the English fleet recruited the island's dispossessed whites who joined its soldiery, a job that entailed risking one's life but also brought the possibility of plunder or even land. So these crackers were sitting up there joining the military not out of loyalty but out of greed. When the expedition sailed away on March 31st, 1655, it took away some 4,000 white Barbadians, mostly formerly indentured servants who were never to return. In their wake were sent a rougher class, defeated Scotch and Irish soldiers captured in battle, sent as laboring prisoners along with the troublemakers, the Catholics, and former landowners. So as you can see, they sent the criminals and the hookers, the outcasts of society, to their settler colonies in attempts to settle land. The Western Design Expedition's attack on Santo Domingo was a murderous failure. repulsed definitely, definitively by the Spanish. But the expedition turned its sights more successfully on Jamaica. Cromwell's navy invited pirates to Jamaica's gaudy, raunchy, now disappeared capital of Port Royal, beginning a golden age of piracy in the Caribbean. While England launched attacks against Spanish coastal towns, the pirates, most famously Henry Morgan, attacked Spanish shipping, provoking a two-fronted war that expelled the Spanish from Jamaica in 1655, though it took another 5 years for the English to subdue the insurgency. This first dislodging by force of Spain from an established colony sparked a new rush for riches as politically connected merchants jockeyed for positions in Jamaica. Few, if any, of the former Barbadian yeomen who had come to Jamaica with the fleet benefited. However, most died of disease. Some surviving soldiers received land grants and became planters, amassed large fortunes through the use of slave labor, and achieving that rare, coveted condition, class mobility. After Cromwell died in 1658, just 3 years after all this upsurging of pirates and whatnot, probably of a bacterial infection, the Roundheads of England deteriorated into bickering factions, and the Cavaliers retook power. The extravagant, lecherous, French raised Charles II, son of the beheaded Charles I, ascended to the English throne in 1660. Amid widespread rejoicing at the departure of the unpopular regime, the theaters of England, shuttered by the Puritans, reopened. It what had been remembered as the restoration of London once more began to have a public life after more than a decade of Puritan sobriety as an age of coffee houses began. With the restoration came an aggressive new commercial policy designed to project an image of grandeur by maximizing the royal share of the world. Charles II was not much interested in governing. He was attuned to the importance of the colonies. Many places in the New World had been named for his father, and Maryland bore the name of his mother. In appreciation for Virginia's loyalty, he bestowed on the colony the title of Dominion, a name that persists as Virginia's nickname of Old Dominion. Ownership of Barbadian land was quite concentrated by this time, and sugar production increased precipitously. There were 20,000 black captives on Barbados in 1660, 20 times as many in Virginia. By 1676, the number had grown through importation to 32,473 and 46,602 in 1684. Greetings, Manning for Mayor. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The island, Barbados, became one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Now that the labor force was mostly black, the situation required legal clarification. Barbados had a comprehensive slave code by 1661 that differentiated indentured servants from slaves, with the provisions that were highly disadvantageous to the enslaved. Killing an enslaved person was punishable only by a fine. The code came just in time to be useful to Jamaican lawmakers. Charles II formally annexed Jamaica for England in 1661. Parliament again passed another Navigation Act in 1660, requiring exclusivity of trade by the colonies, who could conduct commerce with only English ships that were captained by English men and three-fourths of whose sailors were English. The forecast wants to know if the author has already mentioned the West Indian Dutch Company. No, he mentioned the East Indian Dutch Company, but not the West India Dutch Company, not in full. So they could only trade with English ships that had English crews that were captained by English men. Subsequent navigation acts were passed in 1662 and 1663 and were followed up by in 1673 and 1696, defining a policy that would in one form or another endure through the Napoleonic era. The navigation acts were highly consequential. By denying the Dutch access to the American markets controlled by England, they consolidated England's position as the number one commercial power. They also empowered the New England colonists, though that was an unintended consequence. New England had been conducting some hemispheric trade since the 1630s. Now, since colonial ships counted as English, the Navigation Acts stimulated the New England shipping industry, turning the New Englanders into the Dutch of England's empire. New England's territorial advancement to the north was blocked by French Canada, especially in the case of the Rhode Island colony founded in 1636 by Massachusetts dissident Roger Williams. New England had little in the way of a hinterland. Rhode Island was like Portugal in that both places consisted mostly of coastline, like the Portuguese Rhode Islanders turned to the sea to make money. The colonists weren't allowed to manufacture. You see how they controlled their economy. You can only trade with certain people. You can't make certain goods. You can only do this, that, and the other. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The colonists weren't allowed to manufacture, but New England ships could run down to the West Indies and exchange their farm and fishing products for molasses, which they brought home and distilled into great quantities of rum. The New Englanders also sold the Barbadians kidnapped Native Americans as slaves. But since the New England was hemmed in by French Canada, their supply was limited. So they were kidnapping the Native Americans and they sold the Barbadians into enslavement as well. Not just the Africans, but the Barbadians were imported Africans that had made their home as Barbados. But because they had codified the slave codes into law based on race, they had taken away these people's personhood. Charles was more interested in trying to find gold than slaves when he chartered the governor and company of the Royal Adventures trading to Africa on January 10th, 1662. Most of Africa had no gold, but the Gold Coast had for centuries provided a money supply to the Muslim world. Its gold traded overland up through the Maghreb into Europe, and it had been trading and turning up in English commerce since at least the 13th century when the Royal Mint was established. Though the Gold Coast resources were partially depleted by the time of the Restoration, it was still a gold producer. At that time, the Gold Coast was not an exporter of African slaves, but an importer. An intra African coastal slave trade conducted by Portuguese captains brought laborers kidnapped from Calabar to labor in the Akan's gold works. So, this is their propaganda saying Africans enslaved Africans to work in the gold mines. Under pressure from the colonies to supply labor, English traders began to insist on taking slaves from the Gold Coast as well as gold and ivory. The company instructed its traders not to pay for slaves with gold but with barter, because the idea was to bring gold home. But African traders quickly began demanding gold for at least part of the price of slaves, the rest being made up of manufactured goods. The Royal Mint began striking a new gold piece in 1663, the first machine minted English coin, intended to be worth 20 shillings. Actual exchange rates were different. Greetings, Joe Friday. I'm so glad that you felt necessary to say something. You're free to listen. A tiny elephant embossed on each one, sometimes an elephant with a castle. Let the world know that England's money was made with Africa's gold. The coins became known almost immediately as guineas from the name of that long stretch of West Africa between the mountain ranges of Sierra Leone and the Bight of Biafra. Elephant and castle guineas were minted until 1726, though later non African themed guineas were minted until 1813. The monarch pictured on the head's side changing with the throne. The castle was a direct image of England's growing importance in the slave trade, while the coin's elephant image depicted another of the sources of wealth of the African trade. Ivory was used in all manner of fine manufactures, notably including musical instruments. Ivory comes from the killing of a male animal. Only the males have tusks of 5 tons or so in order to harvest the approximately 1% of its body weight that was a dentine mass, while leaving the carcass for carrion eaters. As keyboards appeared all over Europe and America, the intelligent animals were slaughtered in large numbers so that their teeth could produce ivory for the fingers of well bred young ladies to caress. The market picking up when the piano began to be mass produced in the 19th century. Ivory toothpicks became a necessary gentleman's item in Europe. In Africa, where hunting elephants was basic to survival and hunting lore was remembered in the form of a song, the animal was consumed after slaughter, and the tusks were used as ceremonial trumpets across a wide range of the continent. England's creation of the guinea spearheaded an offensive in which it squared off against the Netherlands. Charles II's brother James, who would be the future King James II, who bore his brother's traditional title of Duke of York, prosecuted a second Anglo Dutch war, fought on multiple fronts in different parts of the world. The English attached attacked Dutch slave trading positions on the African coast, and in 1664 they took control of New Amsterdam, renaming it New York in honor of the city's new royal master. But they were otherwise badly beaten in the war, which ended in 1667 with England's humiliating defeat. In the treaty negotiations, the English offered to trade New York back to the Dutch in exchange for the sugar producing, money making South American colony of Suriname, but the Dutch refused that offer. The English kept Manhattan, locking in their control of the Atlantic seaboard from New England down to Virginia. That stretch of the American North Atlantic coast, formerly claimed by the Dutch, became the property of the Duke of York, James Stuart. Charles II gave him all the land between New England and Maryland. James, in turn, dealt out the territory between the Hudson and Delaware rivers to John Lord Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. Carteret. Never mind that people already lived here. It was divided into East Jersey and West Jersey, with the whole collectively known as, according to the document signed by James, as New Caesarea or New Jersey, whose birth was thus pure cronyism. Up the Hudson, the Dutch Fort Nassau was renamed Albany for James' Scottish title. Located on the Mohawk River in the gap between the Catskills and the Adirondack Mountains, Albany was perfectly positioned for commerce with the West. The Anglo-Dutch War badly damaged the ineffective company of royal adventurers trading to Africa, which was reorganized and renamed the Royal African Company in 1672. But the new company was so badly managed and it made no attempts to get North American slave owners the labor they wanted. The gap was filled by independent entrepreneurs, which means when they organized a company to take slaves from Africa under the Royal African Trading Company, which would have invited Africans into the market, it was so badly and poorly managed that independent entrepreneurs or other white men filled in the gap. So that's where they tell the truth of the story. As soon as there were slaves, there were conspiracies to rebel, sometimes involving indentured whites as well, sometimes together with the Native Americans. Herbert Aptheker lists the first serious conspiracy involving Negroes in English North America as occurring in Virginia in 1663, when there were still relatively few black people in Virginia and they had only just been declared to be slaves. The Virginia Assembly, in passing a 1672 act that authorized the killing of Maroons with reparations made at a public expense to the individual slave owners thus deprived of property, noted, "It hath been manifested to this grand assembly that many Negroes have lately been and now are out in rebellion in sundry parts of this country, and that by no means have yet been found for the apprehension and suppression of them, from whom many mischiefs of very dangerous consequence may arise to the country, if either other Negroes, Indians, or servants should happen to fly forth and join with them." So they were worried about the enslaved people joining forces with the Native Americans and the indentured servants. So they were always worried about us being able to link up and come together to overthrow them. A similar authorization was passed in 1680, suggesting that the problem continued to vex the Virginians. A plot to murder the masters, neither the first nor the last, was discovered on Barbados in 1674. Whether it existed in reality or not is hard to say, since slave societies were particularly alert to potential uprisings, to the point of sometimes executing people for imagined crimes. According to a pamphlet published in London in 1676, the conspiracy was led by Cormanti, a con people from the Gold Coast. The pamphlet's text is notable for its description, complete with supposedly elephant tusk trumpets, of the artistry and artisanship attended to Gold Coast royal pageantry, of which some 17th century Barbadians would have first-hand knowledge from slave voyages. It also includes an early occurrence of the word Baccarat or Buckra, which would become a black term for whites throughout the English-speaking Americas. This conspiracy first broke out and was hatched by a Cormanatee, or Gold Coast Negro, about 3 years since, and afterwards cunningly and clandestinely carried and kept secret, even from the knowledge of their own wives. Their grand design was to choose them a king, one Coffee, an ancient Gold Coast Negro, who should have been crowned the 12th of June last year past in a chair of state exquisitely wrought and carved after their mold, with bows and arrows to be likewise carried in state before his majesty, their intended king, trumpets to be made of elephants' teeth and gourds to be sounded on several hills, to give notice to their general rising, with the full intention of fire sugar canes, and so run in and cut their masters' and planters' throats in their respective plantations, whereunto they did belong. Some affirm they intended to spare the lives of the fairest and handsomest women, their mistresses and their daughters, to be converted to their own use. But some others affirm the contrary, and I am induced to believe they intended to murder all the white people there, as well as men and women. For Anna, a house Negro woman belonging to Justice Hall, overhearing a young Cormanatee Negro about 18 years of age, and also belonging to Justice Hall, as he was working near the garden and discoursing with another Cormanatee Negro working with him, told him boldly and plainly he would have no hand in killing the Baccaros, or white folks, and that he would tell his master. So we had a traitor amongst us. All which the aforesaid Negro woman, being then accidentally in the garden, overheard and called to him the aforesaid Negro young man over to the pails and inquired of him and asked him what it was they were so earnestly talking about. He answered her and told her freely that it was a general design among them, the Cormanatee Negroes, to kill all the Baccaros, or white people in the island within a fortnight, which she no sooner understood, but immediately to her master and mistress, and discovered the whole truth of what she heard, saying withal that it was great pity so good people as her master and mistress were should be destroyed. This account exemplifies what was already well worn conspiracy theory, combining, as it does, three major tropes of white narratives of slave rebellions. One, decisions taken by a council of slaves from various plantations to stage an organized rebellion, as would in fact happen more than a century later in Saint Domingue and Haiti. Two, the assertion by the chronicler that the intention of the black rebels to kill white men and take white women for sexual use. And three, the salvation of the whites by the intercession of a faithful domestic slave who betrays the conspiracy of the black rank and file out of love for her master's family. These elements reoccur in Master's accounts of conspiracies throughout the hemispheric history of slavery, both black and indigenous. The following excerpt from the same pamphlet concludes with the characteristic final trope of the slave rebellion narrative, portrayed as a happy ending: the torture and massacre by the masters of a number of the enslaved. It also reports a common belief of Africans reported in various parts of the America that the enslaved would return to Africa upon death, saying, 6 burnt alive and 11 beheaded, their dead bodies being dragged through the streets as Spikes, a pleasant port town in that island, and where afterwards burnt with those that were burned alive. The spectators cried out to Tony, Sirrah, we shall see you fry bravely by and by, who answered undauntedly, if you roast me today, you cannot roast me tomorrow. All those Negroes having an opinion that after their death they go back into their own country. 25 more have since been executed. In this telling from a colonist, the death of Africans was only of importance as the cost of doing business. And that is what they thought of Barbados. The Anglo-Saxon model. Give me one moment. As you can see, white people only thought that it was important to note the deaths of Africans as a financial loss to them. It wasn't as if they thought of us as actual humans or people with any agency of our own. They only looked at it as a loss to their business because they needed to then replace the labor. And they were mad because we weren't reproducing children at such a large number. So they were frustrated because we weren't having babies in a way that would have made continuing the slave trade being made profitable for them. The Anglo-Saxon model, which is chapter 12, we're on page 132, starts with a quote by Edmund S. Morgan saying, it was not necessary to pretend or to prove that the enslaved were a different race. Anyone could tell black from white, even if black was actually brown or red. And as the number of poor white Virginians diminished, the vicious traits of character attributed by Englishmen to their poor could in Virginia increasingly appear to be the exclusive heritage of blacks, the Anglo-Saxon model. The first large land distribution in Virginia was overseen by William Berkeley, a royal governor in 1642. A wit and a playwright from the court of Charles I, he encouraged the Cavaliers to come over in large numbers, wrote Bruce Philip A. Bruce, and made his cronies into large landholders. Berkeley remained as governor over a 35-year period, although he was out during the years of the Civil War and the Puritan reign. His years in power were on the whole prosperous ones, but his governorship ended badly with the suppression in 1676 of Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion, the largest colonial-era uprising in the territory of the future United States. Bacon's rebellion was a class war in which the ambitions and fears of frontier planters clashed with the desire of the royal governor to maintain a monopoly of trade with the Indians. A tiny number of families, the gentry, had quickly come to control the affairs of each country, and they had the good coastal land locked up. The leading edge of the economy was on the west, pushing out into the wilderness. In a pattern that would be repeated in various forms during the long westward expansion across the continent, the pioneers made war on the Native Americans in order to enclose the land the savages lived on. To that end, they wanted to get rid of the Indians as fast as possible, abduct them, and sell them to Barbados, thereby profiting, or simply killing them, and considered the expropriated land adequate profit. Bacon, recently arrived in Virginia, led a group that attacked the Pamunkey and then led an uprising against Berkeley in which he promised slaves their freedom if they would fight with him. Bacon was put down by Berkeley after a battle involving 1,000 redcoats sent from London, a battalion of 80 slaves, and 20 indentured servants was one of the last to surrender. In the course of the suppressing of the rebellion, Bacon heavy-handedly massacred a number of the rebels and hung some as well, confiscating the property of anyone he deemed to be an enemy. Ebenezer Cook, the London-born Maryland poet, remembered for his satirical poem, The Sotweed Factor, composed his longest poem about Bacon's rebellion. He described the rebels as bullies, ruffians, debauchees, cheats, gamesters, pimps, and rapparees, and characterized Berkeley's force as a mercenary one. Berkeley, whom the mob detested in Bacon's absence, had invested, transporting from the eastern shore to augment the force he had before, of arms and ammunition stored, and men who fought for ready pay, 12 pence a head for every day, with plunder of all that had taken rebellious oath to Colonel Bacon. And as the forecast says, Bacon was a rich white boy. This was an intra-class war because he couldn't get into the political life of the state at that time, and he was like an outcast. So imagine a Donald Trump type character riling up the natives telling them that I will set you free. There had been uprisings of the poor in England, but Bacon's rebellion brought a new element into the mix that would become a permanent feature of American clashes: guns. Unlike England, Virginia was a gun culture. Whereas in England, only men with estates valued at above 100 pounds sterling were allowed to own guns, writes Kathleen M. Brown. Englishmen in Virginia at all levels of property ownership were expected to own them, especially after the succession of the Dutch threats to the colony during the late 1660s and early 1670s. Guns and slavery were intimately associated with each other. All slave raiding relied on guns, and all slave holding relied on armed repression. One of the messages of Bacon's rebellion was received by the Virginia gentry that new poor freedmen emerging from the indenture every year created a social problem. Enslaving them was not possible. Englishmen would not countenance enslaving other Englishmen. The solution was to shift to African laborers. By replacing English laborers with African ones, they could, in Edmund S. Morgan's memorable phrase, enslave the poor, transforming the underclass from a political threat to a security issue with a color coded caste system. So when they tell you that it's about money, it's not about race. When they tell you it's about class, it's not about race. It's about making a race a permanent underclass. That's why Black people cannot have class, cannot focus on class divisions and things like that. We need to all be Black together because they don't care how much money you make. As a matter of fact, the more money you make, the bigger the target they have on your back. Locked up and dispersed across isolated tobacco plantations, enslaved Africans were easier to control than indentured English, Scottish, and Irish freedmen. Slavery was for life. Manumission, which was common in Spanish territories, would not become so in Virginia. It was widely assumed that if slaves were freed, they would be a danger to the public at large, an assumption that drew on and fed a common belief that Africans were naturally more violent than Europeans and would become vicious if not repressed. But if we were that violent, there would be no white people left, would there? If we were truly as violent as they say we are, there would be no white people left. Though tobacco required much less startup capital than sugar, Virginia nonetheless became a magnet for capital, much of which went into acquiring slaves. With slave labor, Virginia produced more tobacco than ever. In the 3 generations that followed Bacon's rebellion, writes Bernard Bailyn, a hierarchy of the plantation gentry emerged in stable form, dominated by a social and economic leadership whose roots can be traced back to the 1650s and whose dominance in politics was largely uncontested. And you see this, whose dominance in politics was largely uncontested, that was Bacon's issue. The fact that this politicized gentry was principally invested in slaves would determine the course of policy for subsequent generations, leaving future generations to deal with the consequences of a society divided into white masters and black slaves. The great planters of the late 17th century, Virginia established dynasties of wealth in English North America, some of which continue into this present day. They locked the need for slaves into place by making it such a central part of the economy that once implemented, it could not be eradicated, at least not without the destruction of the economic structures they have put in place and the erasure of their accumulated wealth. You hear that? So without slavery, they would be poor, and that was their problem. Future generations were born into a system where they felt powerless to dismantle. The move into a slave society in Virginia bound rich and poor whites together through the privilege of skin color. Land owning Virginians would be free to experiment with democracy since their enslaved working class had no rights to vote. Lesser whites would identify with the masters whose caste they were privileged to belong to and not with the slaves. This implied a considerable commitment to the policing of caste boundaries, since this category of the poor would have to remain repressed and enslaved in perpetuity. Did you hear that? In perpetuity, they thought slavery was going to last. Because in order to uphold their system, it requires a permanent slave class. By the time of independence, some two-thirds of freedmen were landowners. Their society was necessarily organized along different lines than that of England, nurturing the republican tendencies already present in English society and fostering an ideology of liberty that was taken to extremes with guns aplenty. It was a frontier society in which the most brazen won out. A Virginia slave regime was implemented by 1640, the earliest date at which surviving Virginia county records began to mention Negroes, writes Winthrop Jordan, who adds, sales for life, often including any future progeny, were recorded in unmistakable language. There was now a clear distinction between slave and indentured servant, necessary not only in terms of civil and criminal law, but in terms of the market for their services. A transfer of indenture was considerably less valuable than a slave sale, while the changeover from indentured to chattel labor offered political and labor advantages. The greatest benefit for slave owners was the property rights it conferred. It was the profitability of owning slaves as capital added to their capacity for labor that made slavery foundational to Virginia's economy. Did the white supremacists make a deal with the devil? Rhetorical question, of course. There was nobody of English law to evoke, writes James A. Rawley. Slavery may be considered a colonial invention abetted by the English traders in slaves. A legal framework appeared in Virginia for dealing with slavery, one law and ordinance at a time, beginning in the 1650s. In 1662, Cartus Sequitur Ventrium passed to Virginia children the free or enslaved legal status of the mother, thus extending slavery to all future matrilineal generations in perpetuity. Another law, 7 years later, headed an act about the casual killing of slaves exempted slave owners from being charged with felony murder if one of their slaves should die during correction, noting the difference in types of punishment dealt to indentured servants and slaves, stating, the law in force for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master's, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes. In other words, since indentured servants could have their term extended as punishment, but slaves in perpetuity could not, it was necessary to use violence on slaves. I'll stop here and add a note that often white women killing children were the biggest perpetrators of the Casual Killing Act. Were the biggest, they got the biggest benefit from that because they wanted to beat to death these little black and brown babies that walked around with their husbands' faces. They were upset about that, and they would beat these children to death, saying that they were just correcting them. The law even provided a philosophical justification that noted the value of slaves as multi generational property. It cannot be presumed that prepense malice, which alone makes murder a felony, should induce any man to destroy his own estate. So, what they were saying is that it doesn't make sense for anyone to destroy their own property or to casually kill their own slave because this slave is an asset that could be passed down and made more valuable as generations go on because as that slave reproduces, you're getting more money and as that as that slave works, you're getting the value of their labor. Management of slave labor in the Americas generally took from immovable assets or real estate, which could not be separated from the plantation as a whole. This model, employed in the Spanish, Portuguese, and French territories, tended toward maintaining family ties among the enslaved and may have well contributed to the rootedness of the Afro Louisiana population that is notable into the present day. The other, the Anglo Saxon model, protected the creditor by treating slaves as chattel or disposable personal property, like furniture, and allowed the dismantling of a plantation for the instant conversion of its labor force into cash, breaking family relations among the enslaved whenever it was financially expedient. The Barbadian Code at first considered slaves to be real estate, but was amended in 1668 to reclassify them as chattel, alienable from the land, conforming with the facts on the ground that quickly became a part of Virginia law as well, where the forward looking knew that massive importation of African slaves would soon would come soon. The logical consequence of capitalizing slaves as chattel was that creditors felt more secure in investing in slaves. As the international slave market became stronger, the chattel principle also supported the creation of a locally traded market in slaves, who were self increasing sources of riches, an important domestic business during those days of restricted foreign trade. Because remember, they could only trade with English ships led by English captains, with three-fourths of the crew being English. By the time slave ships began to disgorge hundreds weekly into Virginia, a legal framework for slavery was already in place. This legal infrastructure would be subject to constant revision, but the basic questions were settled by the time of the great wave of African arrivals in the first days of the 17th century. By 1690 or so, perhaps a little earlier, Virginia's labor force was majority enslaved, not indentured. The society became even more unequal as land owning slaveholders became wealthy men and the formerly indentured were shut out of participation in the economy and from land owning. Despite the glamour of the royalist cavalier image, most British emigrants to Virginia were indentured servants, most of them young men, in marked contrast to the Puritan New England, which was more middle class and more egalitarian. Virginia received the rich and the poor, exalting the former and exploiting the latter. So, exalting the rich and exploiting the poor. Many of the Virginia colonists, confronting the daunting physical problems of clearing and planting wilderness land, never bothered to establish former title and did not necessarily know how. Many would move on. Their relentless, unrotated farming of tobacco exhausted the soil of the necessary nutrients after a few years, and the West was always beckoning with the same promise of more land. Old Dominion, or Virginia, became concentrated in large holdings, which ultimately facilitated the cultivation of tobacco and the importation of slaves. The consequences for American society were permanent. During a brief period in the late 17th and early 18th century, writes Anthony S. Parent in his study of the creation of Virginia Slave Society between 1660 and 1740. A small but powerful planter class, acting in their short term interests, gave America its racial dilemma. A miserably fed, clothed, and housed force of enslaved black laborers was what planters wanted, and that's what they bequeathed. Only the wealthy could afford to own an enslaved workforce, so the influx of slaves created an additional competitive advantage for the larger planters, even as the enslaved people themselves counted as wealth for them. The workers who produced the crops, writes Lauren S. Walsh, sounding a note repeatedly expressed by writers on the subject, the workers who produced crops were almost invariably the most valuable asset the planter possessed. The rich of Virginia became richer, and the super rich, or great planters holding thousands of acres and exceptionally large labor forces, probably increased from fewer than a dozen in 1640 to around 80 at the close of the Seven Years' War in 1763. While generally the colonial wealthy and had unimpressive fortunes compared to the income English lords had, the Virginians had them beat in terms of luxurious living. They had slaves who made the planters' lives comfortable in every detail. The planters had to superintend their affairs closely, though unlike the island confines of the sugar-producing Barbados and Jamaica, the extensive tobacco lands of Virginia were not conducive to absentee ownership. Planter William Fitzhugh wrote about a proposed land deal in 1689, saying, "It's not worth twopence to anyone that is not actually upon the spot." Not all farmers understood the importance of legal documentation, but it made a fortune for those with English legal training and connections. Holding public office in early Virginia was a direct path to personal enrichment on a drastic scale. Members of the oligarchy who knew best how to appropriate land helped themselves to large tracts. Claimed and commodified by England, this newly fenced land was given to individuals who were in a position to use it to create wealth. The laws were crafted so as to make rights of property, both the enclosed land and the human labor, sacrosanct at foundational levels to the society built atop the Chesapeake, creating a network of property owners whose descendants have traditionally been of high social importance in the region. So they're still rich to this very day. Writing the 19th century, Stephen Dale notes that white births were recorded in a Bible, black ones in a ledger. It was that way already when the big ships began sailing from Africa to Virginia. Black servitude was perpetual, including future children of the enslaved person and their children and their children's children, founding a fortune of human property within a few generations through the power that came with the to be called, natural increase. Consider a hypothetical example of the economic power of the capitalized womb. If an enslaved girl brought from Africa in 1695 survived long enough to give birth to four children who survived long enough to be of reproductive age, which typically entailed giving birth to a number of other children who died. And if two of those four surviving children were girls, and each similarly producing four surviving children recursively over 165 years or for 12 generations, supposing 15 years to be a generation, a first generation enslaved woman's womb would thus engender a population of 2,048 people by 1860, all of them legally considered property, each of them with a cash value. The only thing hypothetical about that scenario is the numbers. Apart from that, it in fact happened. Enslaved women began having children as soon as their bodies were able, and their children were handed down as inherited property from generation to generation. There was a white family's fortune to be accumulated from the increase of a single African kidnap victim. That Virginia planters understood this is clear from the records of one of the first planters for whom we have much documentation, who was also a lawyer. On the strength of his correspondence, an English born William Fitzhugh was a pioneer not only in the use of an enslaved labor force in Virginia, but also in comprehending the value of owning the laborer's children and descendants in perpetuity. Anthony S. Parent writes, he did not have to purchase laborers. He could grow his own. He thought of his blacks as stock, not unlike cattle, that could be bred indefinitely. He boasted in 1686 that most of his 29 enslaved workers were Virginia born, and the Africa born there were as likely as most in Virginia. So he was saying that he had almost as many slaves born in Virginia as he had born in Africa. So his increase, his profitability was increasing substantially over time because he didn't have to buy as many slaves, he could just make them. In a 1681 letter about a slave cargo, the place of origin is not noted. Expected to arrive into York, Virginia, Fitzhugh requested a colleague there to buy me 5 or 6, whereof 3 or 4 to be boys, a man and a woman, or men and women, the boys from 8 to 17 or 18, the rest as young as you can procure them. For price I cannot direct therein, because boys, according to their age and growth, are valued in price. He used the word breeders, writing of his holdings. Fitzhugh anticipated cheerfully that Negroes' increase, being all young and a considerable parcel of breeders, will keep that stock good forever. He does not appear ever to have purchased any more Africans. Were more documentation existent of the thoughts and actions of 17th century colonists, one would presumably find more examples of this line of thinking, as per the 1696 deed in Hampton, Virginia, turning over one Negro lad named Will and one gray mark, and their increase to him and his heirs forever. Educated in England as a lawyer and elected to the Virginia House in Burgess in 1676, Fitzhugh used his office to acquire vast parcels of land through abuse of the headright system. He had labor to work it, his workforce increasing as long-range value of owning people's perpetual descendants worked its actuarial magic. When Fitzhugh died in 1701 at the age of 50, not an uncommonly early age to die in colonial Virginia, he was a very wealthy man. He had not only been highly successful accumulator of land, but had also watched his holdings of human beings increase on their own, or perhaps with his and his son's help, as household sexual abuse of servants by gentlemen was common. Fitzhugh's informative will makes clear the ideal of legacy in Virginia, dividing out his possessions among his widow and 5 sons. His married daughter, Rosamond, was not included. It begins with bequests of land, awarding 5 parcels containing a total of 30,918 acres to his eldest son, named William Fitzhugh, to have and to hold the said tracts and parcels of land to him and the heirs of his body, lawfully begotten forever. it's important that he state the heirs of his body, so his own progeny and offspring, lawfully, which means in marriage, begotten. So had so these are not bastards we're talking about. So if he got a prostitute pregnant or if he got a slave pregnant, they could not inherit. Dividing among his remaining sons and his widow a total of 27 parcels comprising 49,500 acres, he described precisely whom each parcel had been acquired and any details and conditions attaching to it. For example, all that tract or parcel that I brought to Mr. Watt, contact 400 acres lying upon Rappahannock, one half thereof being now leased to William Yates. Once the lands were bequeathed, Fitzhugh divided up his slaves. His style of disposition made clear that he saw them as the most valuable part of his family's heirlooms, parceling out different households in the region his 51 Negroes and mulattoes. And it's important here to note that he had mulattoes because he had taken liberty with some of these women and had created biracial children. Because if he was proud that he had as many slaves from Africa as he had from Virginia at one time, and that he was breeding these enslaved people to to increase the number of slaves he had in his property. And when he died, he had Negroes and mulattoes. Where do you think the mulattoes came from? Anyway, in the region, his 51 Negroes and mulattoes, providing inadvertent witness to the multi generational skin lightening process, had already begun in Virginia. And as for what personal estate God Almighty had been graciously pleased to endow me with, and I give and bequeath as follows. Item 1. I give to my dear and well beloved wife 7 Negroes, to say, Harry and his wife Catherine, Kate Will and his wife Peggy, Hannah and her youngest child, and to her, and her dispose forever. I give to my said beloved wife 1 silver basin, 3 silver plates, 1 of the lesser silver candlesticks, a silver salt, half my sister's silver spoons, in the house of the second best silver, tankard, a silver porringer, and a large silver ladle, the great silver tumbler, to her and her heirs forever. The enslaved Hannah left no record of her thoughts. So we do not know how she responded to the news that she was being bequeathed to Mrs. Fitzhugh, along with her youngest child only, while her other children, Florrie, Rose, and Robin, went to one of Fitzhugh's sons. Her family divided up like so many silver spoons. Still, there was some consolation. Hannah would be in the same country as her children, and perhaps they would see each other from time to time, or could at least hear news of each other. You see, Virginia's enslaved population grew to its own extent into its own extended communities through the fragile webs of kinship that parceled those of the masters with the grapevine as a means of communication. Despite the regime of dehumanization that confronted the enslaved, a multi generational African American community was forming in Virginia, which was also much home to Hannah and her children as it was to the Fitzhugh's heirs. Sugar in Barbados, tobacco in Chesapeake, following the whirl of the ocean gyre, a global production cycle still in its early stages took slave labor from Africa to raise crops in the Americas that were consumed in Europe. But Barbados was full. Population pressures were already palatable there in the 1640s. After the Restoration, the Barbadian royalists who had been loyal to Charles II during his years of exile were now influential in his court, successfully petitioned the king to be allowed to create a colony in southern Virginia that would be christened with the Latin version of his name, Carolina. Carolina wouldn't cost the king anything. It would be a buffer between Virginia and the Spanish territories, and it would be the perfect expansion slot for Barbados. So, as you can see, these people never intended for slavery to end. They wrote it in their wills, they documented it. They wanted people to be enslaved, and they wanted this thing of enslavement to benefit their children. That's why, if you felt like if there were a race war and you felt like you needed to exterminate all of these people from age from from birth to death, then I couldn't blame you for it, because the extermination, the ownership of our people is what they wanted. They wanted to document that they would own us for life, and any children that we had, and any children that our children had. And they impregnated us on purpose. So you have to understand the mindset of these people. They violated us, and they then forced us to create them, and then they tortured those children that they created. So, as you can see, if you felt like it was necessary to do what you needed to do from age 0 to 100, then it's perfectly understandable why you would make that choice, because they didn't make a distinction between, you know, cutting women's wombs open and serving up children for alligator bait and pressing in the heads of children. They didn't make a distinction. So we shouldn't make a distinction. Blood debts must be repaid in blood, and they owe us a blood debt. All right, guys. I want to thank Manning for mayor, the forecast, Sister Raw, and the elders listening with her, and Anthony McBell, as well as NG2 for listening today. I know that KW Down 7 is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening, and so many others. John Henry is listening. I know that Ned the Wino is listening. Peggy Johnson is listening. And you, dear listener. Yes, even you. I will be back here Monday at 7 p.m. And I will be back Thursday reading and finishing off African Centered Consciousness versus the New World Order by Amos Wilson, Garveyism in the Age of Globalism. I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate and value each and every one of you. Just remember, do what you have to do to protect you and your family. All right, guys. Peace.